All right, left is best. Did you see Ted Cruz threaten Latin American or LATAM socialists and Marxists? How should Latin America prepare? LATM is short for Latin America. For a second, I was like, what does that stand for? Latin America. How should Latin America prepare for even more active measures by the US? I can only think of alliance with China, which is immune to Western sanctions. Yes, alliance with China is good, but as Vijay Prashad says, that's not everything, right? You can't, socialists around the world can't just look at China and be like, wow, China's doing really good. I'll just sit back and relax and let them, carry out world revolution. It's not going to happen, right? China's helping countries develop themselves. They're helping the proletariat come about in countries who have been prevented from developing by imperialism for years. But the solution is still for these countries to struggle for socialism, right? The solution is for all of Latin America to do what Venezuela is doing or what Bolivia is doing, have the working mass take control of the government, start creating systems of worker democracy, creating systems like Venezuela's Popular Assembly or their commune system, which allow them more control of the government, more political democracy, and more control of production and economics, more economic democracy, socialist democracy, and struggling against empire, right? Asserting themselves as a force against empire, the way that Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua have done. And there's countries moving that direction, right? You have countries electing social democrats, but usually, those social democrats have been like Pedro Castillo or Gabriel Boric, where they folded to the empire. They've been like, yeah, I'm not a far right-wing extremist, but Venezuela and Cuba, they're evil because they're socialist. Ooh. Basically giving lip service to the empire while being better than having a reactionary or a right-wing imperialist in power in Chile or wherever else. So yeah, the answer is to struggle for socialism, and of course, as I always say, the main answer, those countries are struggling for socialism. The working masses are getting organized; they're doing their best. And countries like Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela have been struggling against imperialism for years, trying to build socialism. But what would help all those countries more than anything would be if we got socialism in the US or in the UK or in France or in Belgium or in any of these countries who have been holding Africa and Latin America under the boot of imperialism and exploiting the crap out of their resources for years. Right? If we could take out the imperialist ruling class and turn our own country into a worker state, that would weaken the empire so much, right? Which that's not something Latin Americans can do. Obviously, they're focused on their own struggle, but that's what we should do. I meant economic alliance like BRICS. Yeah, I totally agree with you, and I totally understand what you're saying, and that's what I meant by yes, closer ties with China. And that's what I meant by China is developing the productive forces in these countries while not just spreading socialism to these countries. That's what BRICS is doing. Allowing countries to build up their productive capacity, allowing them to develop real productive infrastructure, which creates real value for their people. And in doing so, you also create the proletariat, the working class starts cooperating as productivity increases, and you create the possibility for socialism, a possibility that in many countries has been prevented by imperialism, because imperialism stops countries from developing their productive forces. All I'm saying is that China's not doing the ideological part, right? They're not doing the struggle for these countries. These countries still need to struggle for socialism themselves. China's just helping these countries build up their material base, build up their productive base, which helps their people survive imperialism and creates the possibility for socialism. Because you can't do socialism, in a country without any industry or without any productive capacity. Which is why imperialism protects or prevents productive capacity and destroys productive capacity and infrastructure, versus China and the Belt and Road Initiative build up productive capacity. Because China wants countries to progress and eventually progress forward towards socialism. The US wants to hold countries in poverty and continue to exploit them so we can selfishly accumulate. Or not the American masses, the American ruling class, the American political class, because that wealth do not really trickle down. As this comrade was talking about here, Ted Cruz recently went on a tirade while in Latin America, probably because he's angry about what China's doing, He's angry about the Belt and Road Initiative. He's angry that Daniel Ortega, the socialist president of Nicaragua, and Nicolas Maduro, the socialist president of Venezuela, condemned Nancy Pelosi for her visit to Taiwan, refused to recognize Taiwan as anything except for part of China, which it is and it has been for hundreds of years. The U.S. is angry and indignant. They are indignant that they can't enslave the world anymore. That's exactly what Daniel Ortega said. And he hit the nail on the head with that one. That is what Ted Cruz is doing in this video. And that is what the US empire is doing right now. They're throwing a literal temper tantrum because the rest of the world doesn't want to be enslaved anymore. Because China, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Iran, Russia, Syria, all these countries are forging closer ties and forging closer alliances, especially China with their Belt and Road Initiative, which are, forging countries together in an alliance against the U.S., a pole against the U.S. We're moving into a multipolar rather than unipolar world. But also helping these countries develop their productive forces so they can feed people and so they can house people and so they can have infrastructure and survive. Because the imperialists and the imperialist financial organizations like the IMF and World Bank have prevented so many of these countries from doing this for years. So now China's coming in and undoing all the damage and destruction that the U.S. has done in many ways. They're not undoing it, but moving past it and moving beyond it and moving towards development. And then fat losers like Ted Cruz living in Miami, accumulating the wealth of empire and getting paid by his donors, throws a temper tantrum. Let me enslave you, Latin America. Let me enslave you, China. You guys are dictators because you're not letting me keep your people as slaves and steal all your resources for my mansion that I earned by doing imperialist aggression for my donors. And they throw a little hissy fit. Well, I mean, it's hilarious to watch. Hilarious to watch Ted Cruz's meltdown.
We don't support Marxists in Latin America, and any leftist leader who chooses socialism will be held accountable by the United States.
Guess what? Guess what, you tubby piece of You don't get to control Latin America anymore. They can choose socialism if they want. And they have chose socialism, even though with Operation Condor, you and the US intelligence agencies tried to torture and kill every single leftist in the continent. They're still moving towards socialism. They're still choosing socialism. And there's nothing the US can do about it anymore. Cry harder.
Already, 9 governments across South America, Central America, and the Caribbean are controlled by socialists. All of these governments, with only one exception, are also overtly and ideologically anti-American. Colombia will become the 10th government in the region controlled by the hard left when the country's new president, Gustavo.
They're not anti-America. They're not. Kayla Pop, one of our writers, went to Venezuela and interviewed some of the Chavistas, some of the socialist leaders, about America. There are many interviews with Fidel Castro where he says the same thing. We are not against the American people. We are not against the American masses. We are not against the American workers. We are against the American empire.
Entonces, ¿qué le queda al pueblo de estos países? ¿Qué le queda al pueblo de Estados Unidos? Tomar las banderas y exigir, paren la guerra, paren las invasiones y todo ese dinero que se destina para guerras, para invasiones, dedíquese o destínese para el buen vivir o el mejor vivir de los pueblos pobres de los Estados Unidos.
The American empire, which is made up of bankers and industrial capitalists and political elites like Ted Cruz, accumulating wealth and not only stealing and exploiting wealth from the global south and the rest of the world, but from their own people, from the American masses who are the ones sent to fight and die in these wars for imperialist aggression and expansion. So it's not that these countries are anti-America, Ted Cruz. They're anti-you. And you are trying to trick us, the American workers, into thinking they're against us. But we're not stupid anymore. We're not going to let you deceive us anymore. And we know that's not true. We know we have more in common with the Latin American proletariat than we do with the politicians and oligarchs of our country who are trying to exploit both us and them. Continue to throw a temper tantrum about it.
Gustavo Petro will take office. I am deeply worried that once he does, Colombia will join the ranks of anti-American forces in Latin America. Petro is the first openly Marxist to be elected president of Colombia. He was brought to power by Colombia's leftist fringe, including guerrillas and terrorist groups. Colombians are well aware of what has happened in other Latin America.
Actually, we talked to some of the Colombians who organized for Gustavo Petro, who were part of his campaign, and they weren't using guerrilla tactics. There are guerrilla movements and rebel groups in Colombia, but that's because the U.S. literally occupies Colombia. There's an insane amount of U.S. military bases and U.S. military presence and U.S. NGOs there. Hugo Chavez called it the Israel of Latin America. They're constantly, the U.S. constantly uses Colombia to attack and launch coup attempts at Venezuela. But they did win via election, right? That's why those rebel groups exist, because they're fighting against the literal right-wing occupation of their country, right? But they won via election. But the organizers told us that they were getting shot at, or people were risking death, and campaign managers and staff were being killed because there's so much right-wing violence and neoliberal violence that the U.S. has brought to Colombia, and they've continually maintained a stranglehold on Colombia. So even though these people are literally getting shot at while they try and vote, getting shot at by groups backed by the U.S., who's apparently in Colombia bringing them democracy while shooting people trying to vote, even despite that, they still elected a Marxist. They still beat the U.S. and the neoliberals. You occupied their country with guns and AK-47s and every cent that the American, a bunch of American tax dollar money, spent that on controlling Colombia, and you still couldn't win. What a fat L.
American countries that have elected or have seen leftists seize power. Cuba and Venezuela, for example. I don't want to see Colombia follow the example of other socialist governments in the Western Hemisphere. We know where that leads. Both Cuba and Venezuela used to be prosperous countries until leftists came to power. Castro and the communist revolution succeeded there. Maite Sonia fought in the counter-revolution against Castro. Mexican President López Obrador seems intent.
We know where socialism leads. My family fought in the counter-revolution. That's where socialism leads, is it, Ted? To the U.S. funding and arming fascistic counter-terrorist or counter-revolutionary groups to try and destabilize any country that builds socialism. It leads towards crippling U.S. sanctions. It leads towards destabilization, death, and hunger caused by the U.S. to prevent countries from developing themselves. That's a great example of where socialism leads. It leads the U.S. to throw a temper tantrum and fund counter-revolution. But even after years and years and years and years of doing that, socialism is still winning, which shows why you, Ted, and your family hate it so bitterly. Hate it so bitterly because you just want to keep accumulating wealth and keep killing those darn pesky brown people in the global south who are trying to rise up against imperialism. And now you're throwing a temper tantrum as imperialism is on the decline and socialism is on the incline. And yes, your grandparents who fought in violent US-backed right-wing neoliberal counter-revolutions and killed socialist organizers and leaders for empire and for their own accumulation of wealth, yes, they fought for nothing. They fought on the wrong side of history, as did you, Ted Cruz, because socialism will win.
On making these trends worse. The Colombian far left gained momentum and Petro was elected. Petro says he will work hand in hand with Nicolas Maduro's oppressive regime in Venezuela. He is looking to work with the National Liberation Army, a terrorist organization in Colombia. He will embrace the FARC. FARC is an organization of Marxist-Leninist narco-terrorists. How great!
And FARC, I was talking about this with my friend the other day, who's got a lot of very close friends in Colombia who don't like Petro. They're not socialists. But the U.S. has been in Colombia so long. Look at Ted Cruz's angry, stupid face. But the U.S. has been in Colombia so long, occupying them, funneling their money into Colombia. And apparently it was to fight the drug trade, right? Apparently America needs to keep tons and tons of military bases in Colombia, not to threaten Venezuela or launch coups at Venezuela or enforce sanctions on Venezuela or prevent Colombia from electing or putting a left-winger in power. It's to fight the drug trade. Right? Yet FARC is still a thing, right? FARC still has control in in Colombia. Gustavo Petro is a former rebel from FARC. And the U.S. is still, oh, they're narco-terrorists. They're Marxist-Leninist narco-terrorists. If that's true, and that's why the U.S. needs to be there, why is there still narco-terrorism? Why haven't we been able to stop it? Why haven't we done anything about it? It almost seems like the U.S. isn't there bringing human rights and fighting terrorism and fighting narco trafficking. It seems like that's an excuse for us to be there so we can keep a permanent military base in Latin America and also prevent anything like this from happening. Prevent Colombia from electing a left-winger who might try and kick the U.S. out of their country. And it almost seems like FARC isn't going away because the Colombian people realize this. They realize the U.S. has installed neoliberal dictatorships, violent neoliberal dictatorships against them. And so they've taken up arms in resistance. If they were just gangs selling drugs, you would think the U.S. military would be able to take them out. But that's not what it is. It's a grassroots thing that's never going to go away because, as we said at the beginning of the stream, socialism will always follow capitalism wherever it goes. It will always be the antithesis of capitalism until it grows to the point where it can destroy capitalism. And that's what we're seeing in Colombia, and that's what Ted Cruz is having a temper tantrum about.
An anti-American Marxist in a close ally of ours in Latin America.
An anti-American Marxist. We only need counter-revolutionary terrorists like my grandpa. That's what he fought for. I'm Ted Cruz. As I kind of stole Kyle Kalinske from Secular Talk, his impersonation of Ted Cruz. I'm Ted Cruz. Yeah, cry harder, Ted.